Welcome to Nightmare Files, where real horror and chilling mysteries come to life. From eerie footage to unsettling stories, prepare for nightmares you won't forget. Two months ago, I received word that my uncle had passed away. Although we were never close, his will left me his old house. As a new father to two little girls, I couldn't afford any extra burdens, so I planned to sell the property as quickly as possible. To expedite the process, I decided to move in temporarily and work remotely from my laptop and phone, while my wife remained busy with her job. At first, I thought this arrangement would be a brief getaway, a short, quiet break. But within days, strange happenings began to unravel. Objects would inexplicably vanish, fleeting shadows brushed past the edges of my vision, and time itself seemed to slip into chaos. Even when a real estate agent occasionally visited with potential buyers, the house retained an eerie, suffocating loneliness. Before my sanity could crumble entirely, an elderly neighbor appeared one day, accompanied by a golden retriever she'd been dog-sitting while my uncle was ill. She suggested I keep the dog. Though I was initially skeptical, the animal's loyal and gentle presence soon softened my heart. I even imagined how much joy it would bring to my daughters, and hoped my wife would come to love it too. Yet it wasn't long before even the dog seemed to sense that something was terribly wrong. Despite settling in quickly, it never ventured upstairs. Then, one evening while I was absorbed in my work, I turned away to fetch a snack for the dog, and in that brief moment it disappeared. I raced through the house, from the open kitchen merging into the living room, through the bedrooms and moss-covered stairs, checking every nook, only to find no trace of it. After an hour of searching outside and nearly preparing flyers, frantic barking echoed from the kitchen. The dog had returned as if nothing had happened, leaving me both relieved and deeply unsettled. In the following days, my work consumed me. I skipped meals and even my own care as I juggled endless tasks, setting alarms to remind myself to tend to things, but each distraction only dragged me further into the nightmare. One night, while lost in a sea of numbers, I heard a low whine behind me, coupled with the sound of a door slamming from upstairs. For the first time since the dog had come into my life, it bolted up the stairs without hesitation. My heart pounding, I clutched a frying pan, the only weapon I had against the encroaching darkness, and slowly ascended the creaking stairs. Moonlight filtered weakly through the windows, casting warped, elongated shadows along the endless corridor. At the bathroom door, one I distinctly remembered locking, the door now swung open, as if beckoning me into a realm beyond. I switched on the light, but only a dense darkness met my eyes. Gripping the frying pan tightly, I inched into the pitch-black bathroom. Suddenly, my foot slipped on something sticky. Instinctively, I fumbled for my phone and turned on its light, only to be met with a pool of vivid red liquid spreading around my feet. Overcome with terror, I dropped the phone and fled down the stairs, the dog's mournful whimpers echoing behind me. I called the police immediately. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived with two officers whose flashlights sliced through the darkness. They inspected the upstairs area and dismissed the red as nothing more than rusty water from a burst pipe. Their dismissive chuckles did little to ease my mounting dread, and my battered phone was beyond repair, forcing me to rely on the old landline in the kitchen. Day by day, the house grew more oppressive. One morning, worn down by the relentless tension, I was granted a week off to recover. In that fragile reprieve, I tried to make amends for neglecting the dog, playing with it, feeding it properly, hoping to reclaim some semblance of normality. But when I dared to step onto the second floor again, I found a message scrawled in blood-red letters on the hallway wall. "Are you losing your mind?" The taunting words ignited a new terror in me. I called the police once more. They mentioned that similar bizarre break-ins had occurred in the neighborhood. Incidents where nothing was stolen, yet an overwhelming sense of dread prevailed. Desperate, I phoned an old friend nearby to pick me up along with the dog. I hastily packed my belongings, but when I returned to my room, my suitcase had inexplicably returned to its original place, as if mocking my attempt to flee. Determined to escape, I fastened the dog's leash and tried the front door. Although the knob turned freely, the deadbolt stubbornly refused to budge, as if held by an unseen force. In a moment of resignation mixed with hope, I bent down to comfort the dog and then led it out to the backyard. The glass door at the back opened easily, offering a tentative path to freedom. In the yard, beside a rusted iron fence, I noticed an old tree whose gnarled branches reached through the gaps, a possible escape route. I decided to climb over. The dog waited on the other side, but as I descended from a low-hanging branch, it suddenly growled and darted toward a nearby hill. I chased after it along a steep, uneven path, my limbs trembling from exhaustion and injury. When my hand brushed against an old piece of carpet, I looked up and realized that, in a disorienting twist, a vague opening from the house still lay before me. But the dog had vanished without a trace. Worn down and in pain, I collapsed on the stairs, calling out desperately for the dog. Soon the fixed phone in the kitchen rang. I staggered to answer, only to hear my wife's anxious voice informing me that my workplace had reported my disappearance for nearly 9 days. Her words struck me like a cold blade, and panic surged anew. In my confusion, I tried calling the police again, but the voice on the other end shifted to a mocking tone, almost as if saying, "Perhaps it's time to taste the dog's flavor." I slammed the phone down, my heart hammering with dread. In a frantic haze, I bolted back upstairs, where I discovered the dog lying near the bathroom door, unnaturally thin, while the message, "Are you losing your mind?" was scrawled everywhere, on walls, floors, ceilings, even with traces of dripping blood. At that very moment, the front door creaked open. Someone claiming to be a police officer stepped in, but when I looked, he lay collapsed on the floor with a knife buried in his chest, his face fixed in a chilling, unchanging smile. Still clutching my frying pan, I fell to the ground in shock and pain, realizing with crushing despair that the dog, though still warm, had taken its final breath. That night I remained on the living room sofa until darkness fully engulfed the house. The next morning, driven by starvation and loneliness, I forced myself to act. I retrieved an old shovel from the closet on the porch and with trembling hands dug a shallow grave to bury the dog. Each thrust of the shovel echoed in the desolate silence of that cursed house. When I turned back, the front door had mysteriously swung open again. In a moment of panic, I rushed outside and found a police car parked in the yard, its keys left carelessly on the seat. With no money or possessions left, I climbed into the car and drove through a maze of dark, empty roads, my heart pounding erratically, clinging to a fragile hope that the nightmare might finally end. Before long, as I drove through deserted streets, I realized there were no other vehicles or souls in sight. Then, a sudden horror gripped me. I found myself seated in an old armchair in the living room of the very house I thought I'd left. My arms were still raised as if holding a steering wheel, yet in truth I was trapped in my late uncle's home. Turning toward the dining table, I noticed the glow of my laptop. A cold message appeared on the screen. "Lost your mind? Now you'll lose your memory too." In a final act of desperation, I began typing frantic pleas for help, emails, text messages, online posts, until the final words emerged. "I'm sorry I've disappointed you all. For the last time, goodbye." And so I continued to type in a state of manic terror as every door opened to reveal a new, hellish nightmare. A study transforming into a searing inferno, corridors stretching into infinity. The disembodied ghostly voices eventually stole my identity, erasing my past until all that remained was this accursed house, laden with unspeakable horrors. Now I write to preserve what little remains of my sanity, for if I stop, I fear I will vanish completely. Yet the call of the darkness grows louder, echoing in my soul as hunger, exhaustion, and despair overwhelm me. I have lost my way, and I am trapped in this realm of shadows, and I no longer know who I am. I grew up on a secluded 3-acre plot in a small Michigan town, a place where isolation was as constant as the whispering wind through barren fields. My parents trusted me to help manage the property, so I often found myself alone on weekends. Little did I know that the quiet of that place would soon be haunted by inexplicable terrors. When I was 12, one stormy night I was absorbed in an old video game in the living room of our family's aging house, when a sudden, jarring, metallic thud echoed from the backyard. My heart pounding, I dashed to every window until my eyes fixed on the old storage building behind the house. Its heavy steel door, always locked and silent, now hung ajar in the pouring rain. Through a narrow gap, I caught sight of something impossible. A pair of bare, shivering feet moving stealthily in the gloom. Trembling, I grabbed an old rifle from a dusty closet and shouted, "Is anyone there?" But the only reply was the howling wind. Overwhelmed by dread, I retreated inside and frantically dialed 911 in a hushed, shaking whisper as I described the eerie scene. In the tense silence that followed, I distinctly heard heavy footsteps descending the staircase, and then a low, otherworldly voice murmured, "Hey, kid, what's happening?" That chilling sound and the ghostly image of those feet has haunted me ever since, even though the police later found nothing amiss. A few years later, around the age of 14 or 15, our home lay completely empty one eerie night. I was deep into a StarCraft battle on my aging computer in my first-floor bedroom when the doorbell rang twice in a cadence that sent shiver down my spine. With hesitance mixed with ingrained caution, I crept to the door and asked, "Who's there?" All I heard was a soft, fragile female voice from behind the storm door. Peeking through the thin barrier, I saw an elderly woman with an unsettling, fixed smile and vacant eyes, her hands hidden as if guarding a secret. She politely asked to borrow a phone, but her tone carried an eerie weight, as if a curse lay beneath her gentle words. I declined and closed the door, yet moments later, a persistent clinking noise, like metal tapping against glass, emanated from the window next to my desk, as though the specter of that woman was slowly creeping closer. Overwhelmed by terror, I dialed 911 once again, my quavering voice merging with the haunting sounds of the night until dawn finally broke. When I turned 19, circumstances forced me to remain at the house while my parents were away celebrating an anniversary. On a sweltering afternoon, I pulled into a small gas station to refuel. Out of nowhere, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside my pump. A sharply featured man with a well-groomed beard stepped out, greeting me with surprising warmth as he inquired about directions to the interstate. He meticulously jotted down my instructions in a worn leather-bound notebook and even asked for my name. I replied, "Emma." But as I drove away, an unsettling feeling crept over me. The black SUV trailed my car like a silent shadow. When I finally turned into the property's driveway, nestled among thick woods, I distinctly heard a hushed, ghostly call. "Emma. Emma," echoing from deep within the darkness. That single chilling call plunged me into panic, and I immediately contacted the authorities. The persistent sensation of being watched that day has never left me. Not long after these events, another night pushed my terror to new heights. A friend once asked me to watch his little dog, Theo, for an evening. At first, everything seemed normal, but soon Theo began barking furiously at the back door. Stepping outside to investigate, I discovered someone was trying to force the door open. Peering through the security screen, I saw a disheveled man with unkempt hair and haunted eyes. In a trembling voice, he asked, "Have you seen my sister, Melissa?" Although I knew no one by that name lived here, his question sent a surge of dread through me. I firmly told him there was no one named Melissa and reminded him that the property was under surveillance. With a barely audible apology, he lowered his gaze and quickly vanished into the darkness. That encounter left me with the chilling realization that a single moment of inattention, like leaving a door ajar, could invite unspeakable horrors. Each of these incidents, though separated by time, has woven together a tapestry of terror that still clings to my every waking moment. Whether it was the ghostly footsteps at the storage building, the unnerving presence at my door on that lonely night, the silent pursuit by the mysterious SUV, or the desperate inquiry of a stranger at the back door, the ever-present darkness seems to lurk just outside, waiting for the perfect moment to intrude upon my life. Now, as I live with the lingering terror of those nights, I am constantly reminded that in isolation, the unexplained can swiftly become an inescapable nightmare. And sometimes, the shadows hold secrets too dreadful to comprehend. In the early 80s, I lived in South Korea, a land of ancient traditions and modern marvels, yet also a place where the veil between the past and the present could feel unbearably thin. My father believed that exposing my brother and me to the world would forge us into better men. As an American family living in a small neighborhood just off a military base, we were immersed in a culture completely unlike our own. We resided in a modest house perched atop a steep hill at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. From our elevated perch, we could see almost incredulously part of a sprawling wildlife park on one side and a vast cemetery on the other. Our home stood far above the area where monkeys roamed freely in a wild, untamed stretch of forest, a jungle reminiscent of an Indiana Jones adventure. My friends and I would often dash through those dense woods, heedless of local warnings about venomous snakes and forgotten landmines from an era of bitter conflict. Living as the only American family in that cul-de-sac, we were embraced by our Korean neighbors. We might not have spoken the language fluently, but there was an unspoken understanding among us all. Across from our house lived an elderly couple with a lush garden. The kind gentlewoman, whom everyone respectfully called Halmione, welcomed us with warm smiles and often invited us to help in her garden in exchange for steaming barley tea and sweetgrasses cakes. We adored her generosity. Yet, despite the idyllic neighborhood, a shadow always loomed over Halmione's property, the cemetery that bordered her garden. This was no ordinary resting place. In South Korea, tradition dictated that burials were often conducted in above-ground mausoleums carved into the hillsides. These crypts, constructed from massive polished stones arranged over square courtyards, bore recesses for coffins and small shelves for offerings, coins, food, flowers, incense, all presented in remembrance of lost loved ones. Below Halmione's home, a valley climbed into another hill, its slopes dotted with these crypts and ancient stone pathways, worn and crumbling with time. The sight was both solemn and eerie. One evening, Halmione asked that I join her alone. As the eldest, she said she had something important to show me. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She led me to the back of her flourishing garden and seated me on a sturdy wooden bench, intricately carved with scenes of fishermen and warriors. After a few moments, she returned with a tray carrying steaming barley tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting beside me, she admired the brilliant colors of the sunset as the sky shifted from soft pastels to deep oranges and reds. In a hushed tone, Halmione recounted how she had seen my brother, me, and some local children daring each other to traverse a winding stairway that led down into the cemetery. The path, she explained, was a treacherous descent of hundreds of steps, many cracked or broken, winding through overgrown shrubs and steep inclines. The true test, however, was not the descent itself, but the challenge of wandering among the crypts under the cover of night. Halmione warned that such a venture was a grave mistake. She told me that many years ago, during a bitter war, the enemy was depicted as nothing short of monstrous devils sent to murder the innocent. The terror instilled by wartime propaganda drove many desperate souls to choose death over capture. With nowhere to run and no refuge to be found, countless Korean citizens hurled themselves from cliff faces rather than endure torture at the hands of what they believed to be their enemies. I was horrified by this revelation, overcome with a sorrow so profound that tears welled in my eyes as the sky darkened. Halmione squeezed my hand gently, assuring me that the past was a reminder, a lesson to prevent history from repeating itself. She continued, describing the tragic tale of a young woman who, with her 2 children, had taken the ultimate leap of sacrifice. Though she survived the fall and lingered in a coma for months, when she finally awoke, she discovered her children had vanished, buried within one of the many unmarked crypts of the cemetery. Consumed by grief, she spent endless days and nights wandering the maze of mausoleums, her cries echoing among the stones until one day she cast herself into the ocean, desperate for reunion. Yet they say she never found her children, and her act of self-destruction condemned her to an eternity of torment, a fate whispered about as that of the White Witch. As dusk fell and the cemetery was swallowed by inky darkness, only dim broken lights casting feeble glows over small patches, Halmione's voice softened. She explained that the restless spirit of that young woman still roamed the grounds, her mournful wails carried on the wind. "People call her the White Witch," she confided bitterly, "a name that only fuels her anger. It's best to avoid her presence and instead offer your prayers for her soul." Then, slowly, she pointed toward the rear of the cemetery. Reluctantly, I followed her gaze. Amid the shrouded tombs, I saw a faint, brilliant white shimmer, a figure moving slowly, swaying as if buffeted by unseen winds. And faint but unmistakable, I could hear the soft sound of weeping growing into low, anguished moans as the figure drew nearer. I was paralyzed with fear, longing to flee, but Halmione held my hand and whispered that we were safe for now, too far from where the spirit roamed. Yet she made it clear, one must never venture into those crypts after dark. I never dared to step down into that cemetery again, nor did I ever return to sit with Halmione under those haunted skies. Out of respect, however, I later visited a place now known as Peace Prayer Park, formerly Suicide Hill, to honor the souls who had suffered so greatly. I wept openly, praying for forgiveness and for the lost, moved by the heartfelt stories shared by the local people. My love for the land and its inhabitants deepened, and the memory of those days remains indelibly etched in my heart. To this day, I often wonder if the White Witch still wanders among the mausoleums, ceaselessly searching for the children she lost. I long to return one day, to wander among the graves, to hear her mournful cries carried by the wind, and perhaps to offer one more prayer for her eternal salvation.